Thank you, Dr. Keane. I completely agree with Dr. Keane, and one of the things I would like to emphasize is the fact that particularly a lot of the studies that were presented earlier by Dr. Coughlin, which was a great review of the literature. I mean, his summary was correct, but that the clinical studies are rare, and most of the studies he presented were, in vitro studies, just using one or two of the chemicals. And I think one of the things we've learned, particularly in cardiology and in other areas of medicine, is that oftentimes, we will find something in vitro, and then when we go to clinical trials, phase 3 and other of the FDA process, we find that the effect that we get actually in the human system is very different to the effect that we derived in the test tube. So I think this is very important in the discussion we're having, and as I discussed yesterday, I think we're dealing with very different systems here, not only in terms of the exposure, whether it be pure caffeine, coffee, or energy beverage, but also the system that dynamics of the body that's being exposed, whether it be genetic effects, age effects, sex effects, exposure effects, and other toxicities that system may be dealing with at the present. And I'd like to re-emphasize the fact that a drug interaction is particularly is in a situation where you have one drug interacting with another drug or other compound or compounds, and when they're administered together, and that can result in either a synergistic effect where the effect is increased, it can result in an antagonistic effect where the effect is decreased, or it could actually create a whole new effect that was unexpected and not predicted by those sort of results. And it's also important to remember that it doesn't have to just be two drugs. It can be a drug in a food or a food product. It can be a drug in a plant or a medicinal herbal product, or it can be, in fact, the drug having an interaction on itself because of changes of the system. For example, someone who is dehydrated may have a different effect within that drug. So I would like to just discuss two brief trials where they actually did something in vivo, actually in a body, and to me it shows that there are some differences between the in vivo studies and the in vitro studies. The first study was looking at 9 individuals who were aged 27, and the interesting thing in this study was that they looked at Red Bull, which had 80 milligrams of caffeine and 1,000 milligrams of taurine, versus a control, which was just the pure 80 milligrams caffeine. And they looked at ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. And what they found was that the blood pressure effect from the Red Bull, which had the caffeine and taurine, was very different and was higher, that it's had more of an effect than the product that was just the caffeine only. So and that was statistically significant. That was by Franks in 2012. And then another interesting study, which drilled it down a little bit more into the effects of taurine on the cardiovascular system, was a study that looked at 13 endurance-trained athletes, and they compared again Red Bull, and then they had a very similar energy beverage, but it had pretty much the same things as Red Bull, but it did not have the taurine in it, and then they had a placebo group. And interestingly, only in the Red Bull group did it show, this was basically what they did is they did a baseline study, and then they had the ingestion, and then they measured the effect into exercise, and they had them performing an exercise, and then they did a recovery. And only in the Red Bull group, which was the only difference between that and the other group, the caffeine drink, was taurine. And only in that group did they show a significant increase in contractility. They had a higher stroke volume. So for whatever reason in that study, with only one different chemical, which was taurine, the heart was having to work harder during exercise. So, we know the body is a magnificent system, and we adjust our ability for the heart to work depending on the situation, depending on what type of work we're doing in exercise. And the body is wonderful at doing that. So you can get the right heart rate, the right blood pressure, ensure the right cardiac output. And interestingly, in this group that had the Red Bull, that had as I mentioned, the taurine was the only difference, their hearts were actually working harder, really, than they needed to. So it was kind of like extra stimulating their hearts, which I thought was very interesting. And then the final was just a case report, and I'm sure some of you have seen the case report. This was a 28-year-old motocross cycle rider who in Australia who was drinking energy beverages through the day and actually had a ventricular cardiac arrest, was in ventricular tachycardia, and was shocked back to life. And in the hospital had all of the cardiac tests done on him. And actually, when they first went in, they noted he was having a heart attack. He had changes on his ECG. And then when they actually look into the cath lab, he had spasm of all of his arteries. They were all spasmed shut. So there was obviously a very abnormal vascular function going on in this gentleman. And when they did all of the tests, the only things that they came back with that were abnormal on the results, he had very high levels of caffeine and taurine. And the authors suggested that perhaps there is some sort of interaction, again, in this human system, in a situation where someone was consuming energy beverage and then exercising, that may have led to that. So I think that we need to, what this all, and this conference I think is about, and what we've all been discussing, is that it appears that doing things just in the test tube, particularly when it comes to caffeine and these other compounds, doesn't seem like it will predict or be the same as what is happening in actual human studies. And I think we need a lot more of those human studies, and we're starting our Shade 1 study down in Texas, and I hope that there is more and more research done, particularly on these system effects, because as you know, with nonlinear systems, you can have these very unusual and chaotic effects, which may end up being very different, and this will help to fill in, I think, those little parts of the jigsaw puzzle that we're missing right now, and maybe it will help us understand why some individuals are vulnerable and some are not vulnerable to these various types of caffeine exposures. Thank you.